My husband spit in my face in front of his mother and sister and they clapped. I walked away without a word, but 5 minutes later, the house shook when I made one call. The entire living room went silent. The warm wetness dripped down my chin as I heard their celebration. 3 women laughing like they had just watched the best movie ever. My mother-in-law, Helen, sat on her throne-like chair with that mean smile I had grown to hate over the past 15 years. My sister-in-law, Karen, was on the sofa clapping her hands like a little kid at a circus show. And my husband, Mark, the man I had cooked for and cleaned for through good times and bad, stood there looking at me like I was a bug he wanted to step on. "About time," Helen said, her voice full of joy. Someone finally taught her a lesson. The fight had started over something so small I could hardly remember what it was. Maybe it was about what to make for dinner. Or maybe it was about buying new curtains for the living room. Every day, everything I did was wrong in their eyes. I moved too slow, talked too much, spent too much money, didn't spend enough money. I breathed the wrong way. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button for Granny's voice. We want to know how many people hear our stories. But this time when I tried to tell them how I felt, something I rarely did anymore, Mark had walked right up to me and spit in my face. No angry words first, no. Warning, just pure hate made visible. The spit rolled down my cheek as I stood there, unable to move. In 15 years of marriage, through all the mean words and cold shoulders that had become normal, nothing had prepared me for this moment. This wasn't anger. This was pure hate, so strong that I didn't even count as a real person to him anymore. "That's what happens when you don't listen," Karen said, looking at her pretty pink nails. "Maybe now she'll learn to keep quiet." Keep quiet. I almost laughed. They had no idea what I was really capable of. I didn't clean my face. I didn't cry. I didn't yell or hit back like any normal person might do when their husband treats them like garbage in front of his family. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. Smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't even a sad smile. It was the smile of someone who had just figured out that the game was finally over. "You're right," I said softly, my voice calm even though my heart was racing. "Everyone should know where they belong." Mark looked confused. This wasn't what he expected. He was used to my tears, my sorries, my begging to make everything okay. 4 months now, every fight ended with me giving up, saying it was my fault, promising to be better. But that woman, the one who said sorry for being alive, who made herself smaller and smaller to make them happy, she died the second his spit hit my face. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, feeling their eyes watching me. Behind me, I could hear them talking quietly, probably planning what mean thing to do to me next. What they didn't know was that I had figured out their game months ago. In the kitchen, I took out my phone with hands that were not shaking. That surprised me. I thought they would be shaking. I thought I would be crying right now. Instead, I felt calmer than I had felt in years. I looked through my phone until I found the name I was looking for. "Tommy, lawyer," my little brother answered right away. "It's time," I said simply. "Are you sure?" His voice was soft but serious. We had talked about this before, planned for this day. He spit in my face, Tommy. Right in front of his mother and sister. They cheered. The quiet on the other end went on for several seconds. When Tommy spoke, again his voice was completely different. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't say anything else to them. Don't explain. Don't fight. Don't say sorry. Just wait." "I've been waiting for 4 months, I told him. "I know, and now it's over." I hung up and stood in my kitchen. The kitchen where I had made thousands of meals for people who saw me as their servant. Where I had cleaned up after parties I wasn't really welcome at. Where I had swallowed my hurt so many times I had forgotten what my own voice sounded like. The house was very quiet now. No more whispers from the living room. No more happy laughter. Just silence. I walked back toward the living room and that's when I saw them. All 3 of them were standing in the hallway, their faces white as sheets, staring at me like they had seen a ghost. "Who did you call?" Mark's voice had lost all its earlier strength. I didn't answer. I just walked past them to the big window and looked out at the street. A blue car was already pulling into our driveway. Emma. Helen's voice was sharp now, scared. Who did you call? I turned to face them. And for the first time in months I felt like myself again. Not the broken version of myself I had become, but the woman I used to be. The woman who had her own thoughts and feelings and the power to protect them. I called someone who knows exactly where everyone belongs, I said. The doorbell rang, and the sound seemed to shake through the house like thunder. Mark, Helen, and Karen all looked toward the door, then back at me, then at each other. For the first time since I had known them, they looked worried. The doorbell rang again, longer this time. Aren't you going to answer it? Ask nicely. It's your house after all. Mark walked toward the door like a man walking to his own funeral. When he opened it, Tommy stepped inside, carrying his work bag, wearing the kind of face that had made him one of the best divorce lawyers in town. Good evening, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I'm Tommy Wilson and I work for Mrs. Emma Wilson. I have some papers that need your attention right now. The change in the room happened instantly. Helen, who had been so proud and mean just minutes before, seemed to shrink into herself. Karen's face had gone completely white. And Mark, my husband who had embarrassed me, who had spit in my face like I was nothing, looked like he was going to throw up. Papers, he managed to say. Tommy opened his bag very carefully. Divorce papers, a restraining order, and a few other things that I think will be very interesting to everyone here. He handed Mark a thick stack of papers, then turned to Helen and Karen, giving them each their own sets. Ladies, he said with cold politeness, you're also named in several of these papers. The quiet that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the kitchen from 3 rooms away. This was the moment I had been working toward for 4 months. Ever since I had finally admitted to myself that my marriage wasn't just broken, it was cruel. Not hitting cruel, though tonight had crossed even that line, but mean in every other way. They had spent years tearing me down, making me question my own worth, my own mind, my own right to live in spaces they thought were theirs. What they didn't know was that, for the past 4 months, I had been writing everything down. Every mean comment, every trick, every time they had kept me away from friends or made decisions about our life together without asking me. I had recorded conversations, saved mean text messages, and built a case that would make sure I never had to say sorry for breathing again. Tommy looked around the room with the happy look of a man who had just delivered exactly the kind of justice his client deserved. Mrs. Wilson, he said, turning to me. Should we talk about when you'll move to your new place? I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. 4 months of planning, 4 months of secret meetings and careful note-taking. 4 months of pretending to be the same broken woman they thought they had created, and it had all led to this moment. Behind me, I could hear Mark quickly flipping through pages, his breathing getting faster and more worried with each paper he read. Helen was holding her papers like they might disappear if she let go. Karen was just staring at her papers, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. There must be some mistake, Mark finally said, his voice high and desperate. Emma wouldn't, she couldn't. Oh, but she did, Tommy replied smoothly. Mrs. Wilson has been very careful in her planning. I think you'll find everything is very much in order. I looked at the 3 people who had made my life terrible, who had convinced me I was worthless, who had celebrated my shame just minutes before. They looked so small now, so powerless. And for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe again. The next morning I woke up in a hotel room for the first time in 15 years. The sheets were clean and white, untouched by the weight of someone else's expectations. For a moment before memory came back, I felt peaceful. Then I remembered Mark's face when Tommy had handed him those papers. The way his hands had shaken as he read through paper after paper, each one worse than the last. The way Helen had sunk deeper into her chair with every page she turned. The way Karen had gone completely quiet. Her usual stream of mean comments dried up like a dead flower. My phone buzzed with texts I didn't bother to read. I knew what they said. Explanations, promises that things would be different. The same lies I'd been hearing for years, just said with more fear. Tommy had told me not to answer any calls from them. Let them worry, he'd said as he drove me to the hotel last night. Let them wonder exactly how much you know and how much proof you have. The truth was, I had more than they could possibly imagine. It had started 5 months ago with a phone call that was meant for Mark. A woman's voice, sweet and flirty, asking if Marky was coming over tonight because her roommate was going out. When I'd told her she had the wrong number, she'd laughed and said, "Oh, is this the wife? How funny." That single moment had broken the last of my dreams about my marriage. Not because Mark was cheating. Somewhere deep down I think I'd always known, but because of how the woman on the phone had talked about me, like I was a joke, like I was something to be laughed at and forgotten. I'd hung up without saying another word, but something important had changed inside me. For the first time in years I got mad. Really, truly mad. Not the quiet sadness I'd been carrying, but clean, bright anger that cut through all the fog of confusion they'd created around me. That night, while Mark slept beside me, probably dreaming about his girlfriend, I'd made a decision. I was going to find out everything, every lie, every trick, every mean plan that had brought me to this point. And then I was going to use that knowledge to take back my life. Finding out the truth had been easier than I'd expected. Mark was careless, too sure of himself. He kept his phone unlocked around me because he'd trained me so well not to question him about anything. His computer password was our wedding date, which would have been sweet if he weren't using that computer to plan his betrayal. What I found in his digital life made me feel sick. Not just the cheating, though that hurt enough, but the conversations with his mother and sister, planning ways to make me more manageable. The jokes about how I looked, how smart I was, my worth as a human being. The casual cruelty of people who saw me as a problem to be dealt with rather than a person to be loved. There were text messages going back years where they planned how to keep me away from my friends. Helen had actually written out a plan for making me need their money, suggesting that Mark stop me from working and then use money as a way to control what I did. "She's too independent," Helen had texted to Karen. "We need to make her understand that her comfort depends completely on keeping us happy." Karen's answer had been even worse. "Don't worry, Mom. A few more years of this and she'll be so broken down she won't even remember who she used to be." Reading those words had felt like dying and being born again at the same time. The part of me that still hoped we could fix things, that still made excuses for their behavior, had died instantly. But something stronger had taken its place. A determination to prove them wrong about everything. I'd called Tommy that same night. My little brother had always protected me, but he'd also respected my marriage enough not to interfere. When I told him what I'd discovered, the silence on the phone had stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Emma," he'd finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," I'd admitted. But I think I was too close to see it clearly. I kept thinking if I just tried harder, if I just became whatever they wanted me to be. "This isn't your fault," he'd said firmly. "None of this is your fault, but we're going to make sure they pay for what they've done." Tommy had connected me with a careful private detective who helped women in bad situations. Within weeks, we had written down everything. The cheating, which turned out to involve a college girl named Tiffany, whose parents paid her rent while she played house with married men. The money tricks, including credit cards Helen had opened in my name without asking me. The careful emotional abuse that had been so slow, I'd almost convinced myself it was normal. But the most damaging evidence had come from something I'd started doing on my own. I'd begun recording conversations with a small device Tommy had given me. Not every conversation, just the ones where I felt they were planning something particularly mean or saying something important about their real feelings. The recordings were terrible to listen to. Hours of audio where they talked about me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be loved. Helen's voice on tape teaching Mark how to make me feel guilty for spending money on myself. Karen's laughter as she described telling lies about me to other family members, making sure I'd be left out at family gatherings. The worst recording was from just 3 weeks ago. I'd been in the kitchen making dinner when I'd heard them talking in the living room. Something about their tone had made me turn on the recorder. "She's getting suspicious," Mark had been saying. "Tiffany thinks she might know about us." "So what?" Helen's voice had been dismissive. "What's she going to do about it? Leave. She doesn't have anywhere to go. We've made sure of that. Besides," Karen had added, "even if she found out, who would believe her? We've spent years making sure everyone knows how crazy and jealous she gets." They had been planning to make me look insane before I'd even discovered the cheating. They had been preparing to make me question my own mind, to make sure that even if I found proof of their lies, no one would take my side. But they had underestimated me. Or rather, they had underestimated who I used to be before they'd spent years trying to erase that person. I was Emma Wilson, sister to one of the town's best divorce lawyers. I had a college degree in business, which meant I understood exactly what they'd been doing to me and how to write it down properly. I had friends they didn't know about, resources they'd never bothered to look into, and a strength they'd assumed they'd completely destroyed. Most importantly, I had something they'd never expected me to develop: patience. For 4 months, I'd continued to play the role of the broken, quiet wife while carefully building a case that would destroy them. I'd smiled and said sorry and made dinner and pretended everything was normal while secretly recording their cruelty and writing down their crimes. The hardest part hadn't been gathering evidence. It had been pretending that nothing had changed. Continuing to let them hurt me while I waited for the right moment to fight back. Every insult I'd absorbed, every embarrassment I'd endured, every time I'd stayed quiet when they treated me like garbage, it had all been for this moment. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Tommy's name appeared on the screen. "How are you feeling?" he asked when I answered. "Better than I thought I would," I said, and realized it was true. Despite everything, despite the end of my marriage and the destruction of what I'd thought was my family, I felt lighter than I had in years. Good, because they're already trying to fight back. "Mark called my office at 7 o'clock this morning, claiming you've had a mental breakdown and demanding we return his stolen property." I laughed. Actually, laughed. "Stolen property? Apparently, he thinks your evidence gathering is theft. He's also claiming you've been cheating, which is funny considering the situation. Let me guess. Helen's idea. Probably. She called 30 minutes after Mark did, suggesting we could all sit down and work this out like grown-ups. She seems to think this is some kind of marriage fight that can be fixed with the right conversation. The delusion was almost impressive. Even faced with written evidence of their careful abuse, they still couldn't accept that their actions had consequences. What happens next? Yes. Next, they discover that this isn't just about divorce. The money fraud Helen committed by opening credit cards in your name means criminal charges. The harassment campaign they ran against you could be intentional infliction of emotional distress. And Mark's affair with a girl whose parents are prominent local doctors might have some interesting social consequences. My stomach twisted with something that might have been guilt. "Tommy, I don't want to destroy them. I just want them to leave me alone." "Emma." His voice was gentle but firm. "They spent years trying to destroy you carefully, on purpose, cruelly. They celebrated your embarrassment. They planned your emotional breakdown. They stole from you, lied about you, and turned your own marriage into a weapon against you." He was right. I knew he was right. But 15 years of training don't disappear overnight. "The choice is yours," Tommy continued. "We can settle this quietly with good terms for you and small consequences for them. Or we can let them face the full legal and social results of their actions. But you need to decide before they realize how much trouble they're actually in." Through the hotel window, I could see the city waking up. People heading to work, to school, to lives that made sense. Normal lives where husbands didn't spit in wives' faces. Where mothers-in-law didn't plot against their sons' wives. Where families worked with basic respect and human kindness. I wanted that life. I wanted to be one of those people walking with purpose down the sidewalk, heading toward something good instead of running away from something terrible. What would the quiet settlement look like? Yes. good divorce terms, the house, most of the money, and legal agreements that they'll have no contact with you going forward. They avoid criminal charges and public embarrassment. You get your freedom and financial security. And the alternative: full prosecution, public exposure of the affair, the financial fraud, the systematic abuse. They could face jail time, bankruptcy, complete social destruction. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine Mark in jail. Helen facing criminal charges. Karen's perfect reputation in ruins. For months ago, the thought would have horrified me. But that was before I'd listened to hours of recordings where they laughed about my suffering. I need to hear one of the recordings again, I said suddenly. Emma, please. I need to remember exactly who they really are. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then I heard the sound of him typing. Seconds later, my phone buzzed with an audio file. I pressed play and heard my own voice first, asking if anyone wanted more coffee. Then Helen's response. She's so desperate to please, isn't she? Like a puppy begging for treats. Karen's laughter. At least puppies are cute. Mark's voice, cold and mean. Sometimes I wonder what I ever saw in her. She's gotten so pathetic over the years. You saw a doormat, Helen had replied. And that's exactly what we turned her into. I turned off the recording and sat in the silence of my hotel room. These were the people who had pretended to love me, who had stood at my wedding and promised to treat me like family. These were the people who had carefully destroyed my self-worth while making me grateful for the privilege. When I called Tommy back, my voice was steady and clear. I want them to face the full consequences, I said. All of them. The war was just beginning. For days after the divorce papers were served, Mark showed up at my hotel. I was sitting in the lobby with my coffee, watching the morning news when I saw him through the glass doors. He looked terrible, unshaven, wrinkled clothes, the kind of desperate messiness that comes from not sleeping for days. The hotel workers tried to stop him, but his voice carried across the marble floor as he demanded to see his wife. Former wife, I corrected silently. The papers had been very clear about that. Emma, please. He was standing 15 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the red around his eyes. We need to talk. I looked at him over my coffee cup. This man I'd shared a bed with for 15 years and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even the faint echo of love. Just mild curiosity about what he thought he could possibly say that would matter. So talk, I said simply. He glanced around the busy lobby, apparently expecting privacy for whatever show he'd planned. When I didn't move, he reluctantly took the chair across from me. This has gotten out of hand, he began, using the same tone he'd once used to explain why I was overreacting to his mother's latest cruelty. I know we've had our problems, but divorce, criminal charges. Emma, this is crazy. Is it? I took another sip of coffee. Which part seems crazy to you? The part where you spit in my face, or the part where you and your family spent years carefully destroying my self-worth while laughing about it behind my back? His face got red. Those recordings, you can't use those. Recording people without their permission is illegal. I almost smiled. Helen had clearly done some research and fed him this line. Actually, in this state, only one person needs to agree to a recording since I was present for every conversation I recorded. They're perfectly legal. The color left his face. You planned this. All of it. You've been planning to destroy me. No, Mark. I plan to save myself. There's a difference. He leaned forward, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with so many years ago before his mother had convinced him that loving me was weakness. Before he'd learned that cruelty could be disguised as strength. Emma, I know I've made mistakes. We all have. But we're family. Families work through problems together. They don't destroy each other in court. Family. I repeated the word like it was from another language. Mark, do you remember what your mother said when she found out I'd lost our baby 4 years ago? His eyes looked away from mine. Course he remembered. She said it was probably for the best since I'd probably just raise another weakling anyway. And you, my husband, the father of that lost baby, you just sat there and agreed. Mom was upset. Your mother was cruel and you helped her cruelty because it was easier than standing up for your wife. I set down my coffee cup. That's when I should have left, but I stayed because I thought families work through problems together. I thought if I just tried harder, loved you more, made myself smaller, eventually you'd choose me over her. Mark was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. I did love you, Emma. I still do. No, I said firmly. You loved having someone to blame for everything wrong in your life. You loved having someone who would absorb your mother's poison so you didn't have to deal with her yourself. You loved having a scapegoat. That's not true. I pulled out my phone and opened the audio app. Would you like me to play the recording from last month where you told your mother that you sometimes wonder if you'd be happier if I just disappeared? Or maybe the one where Karen suggested you could probably get me put in a mental hospital if I became too much trouble? He went completely still. You don't have a recording of that. But I did, and we both knew it. I'd been in the bathroom when that particular conversation happened, and I'd left the recorder on the coffee table. The sound quality was perfect. Mark, let me make something very clear to you. For 4 months I documented everything. Every conversation, every text message, every email. I have recordings of your mother teaching you how to make me doubt my own mind. I have evidence of the credit card she opened in my name. I have proof of your affair, including hotel receipts and photos Tiffany sent you that I found on your phone. His hands were shaking now. Emma, if this gets out, my job, my reputation. You should have thought of that before you decided to embarrass me in front of your family. I was angry. I said things I didn't mean. I did things I regret. But destroying my entire life isn't going to fix anything. I studied his face, looking for any sign of real sorry, any understanding of the years of pain he'd caused. What I saw instead was the same selfish panic I'd seen the night Tommy served the papers. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done to me. He was sorry he was facing consequences. Your life isn't destroyed, Mark. It's just finally being shown for what it really is. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. Tiffany's parents found out about the affair. They're cutting off her money and kicking her out. Might want to stay away from social media for a while. I showed the message to Mark, watching his face go white. Oh God, he whispered. They know. Dr. and Mrs. Richardson were respected doctors in town, the kind of people whose opinion mattered in social circles that overlapped with Mark's work life. The kind of people who wouldn't quietly tolerate their daughter being used by a married man. Apparently, they hired their own private detective when they got suspicious. Found everything we found, plus some things we missed. Put my phone away. Did you really think you could have an affair for months in a town this size without consequences? Mark buried his face in his hands. This is going to destroy everything. My job, my standing in the community. Your job at the accounting firm that handles Dr. Richardson's business. Yes. Yes, I imagine that might become awkward. He looked up sharply. How did you? Mark, you never were as careful as you thought you were. And you certainly never paid attention to what I actually knew about your life. I stood up, suddenly tired of this conversation. You all made the mistake of thinking I was stupid just because I was kind. Confused silence with ignorance, giving up with weakness. Emma, please. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I'll cut off contact with my mother and sister if that's what it takes. For just a moment I wavered. This was what I'd wanted for so many years. For him to choose me, to put our marriage first, to admit that his family's treatment of me was wrong. But it was too late. Much too late. You can't cut off contact with your mother and sister, Mark. Because in about 3 hours they're both going to be arrested. The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Mark's mouth opened and closed without sound. Arrested, he finally managed. Helen, for identity theft and credit fraud. The credit card she opened in my name is a serious crime. Karen for conspiracy and harassment. It turns out there are laws against working together to isolate and emotionally abuse family members. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Ami filed the charges yesterday. The police are serving warrants this morning. Mark stood up so quickly his chair fell over backward. Emma, you can't do this. They're family. They're all the family I have left. They're criminals, Mark, and they're not my family. They never were. My mother is 75 years old. You want to send a 75-year-old woman to jail. I want a 75-year-old woman to face consequences for her actions. Age doesn't excuse cruelty, and it certainly doesn't excuse fraud. He was walking back and forth now, running his hands through his hair. There has to be something, some way to fix this. I'll pay back the money. I'll make them apologize. With what money? You're about to lose your job, remember? And apologies don't undo years of systematic abuse. My phone rang, Tommy's name on the screen. Excuse me, I said to Mark and answered. Hi, Tommy. It's done. Both arrests went smoothly. Helen tried to claim she was too fragile for handcuffs, but apparently that didn't work. Karen demanded to speak to her lawyer, which is funny since she's about to discover her lawyer has a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest. Dr. Richardson uses the same law firm. They can't represent Karen in a case where their main client is the wronged party. I looked at Mark, who was watching me with desperate eyes, trying to read my face. Thank you, I told Tommy. I'll call you later. When I hung up, Mark was staring at me like I was a stranger. It's done, said simply. Emma, please. No. The word came out harder than I'd intended. No more pleasing. No more begging. No more making excuses for people who never showed me an ounce of real respect. I picked up my purse and started toward the elevator. Where are you going? Mark called after me. To see my lawyer. We have a lot of paperwork to finish. Emma, wait. What about us? What about our marriage? 15 years can't just disappear because of one mistake. I stopped and turned back to him. He was standing in the middle of the hotel lobby, looking lost and broken and completely confused by the collapse of the world he'd built on my suffering. One mistake, I said quietly. Mark, spitting in my face wasn't a mistake. It was the natural result of 15 years of treating me like I didn't matter. It was what you'd always wanted to do. And you finally found the courage to do it. That's not true. Yes, it is. And deep down you know it is. Just like you know that your mother and sister are getting exactly what they deserve. Just like you know that Dr. Richardson has every right to destroy your career over what you did to his daughter. I turned back toward the elevator, then paused. You want to know the truth, Mark. The real truth about our marriage. I stopped loving you 3 years ago. The night you laughed when your mother called me pathetic. The night you agreed with her that I was lucky anyone would have me. I died a little that night, and I've been dying a little more every day since. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside. But I'm not dying anymore, I said as the doors began to close. For the first time in years, I'm finally alive. As the elevator carried me away from the wreckage of my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was. Felt free. The last thing I saw was Mark standing alone in the lobby, surrounded by strangers, finally understanding what it felt like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love him. It was a lesson he should have learned a long time ago. 3 weeks after Helen and Karen's arrests, I was sorting through the belongings I'd gotten from the house when my doorbell rang. I'd finally found a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and that made it beautiful. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I recognized but had never actually met. Tiffany Martinez, Mark's girlfriend. She was younger than I'd expected from the photos I'd seen on his phone, probably mid-20s, with a kind of expensive look that came from having parents who paid for everything. I almost didn't answer. What could she possibly want to say to me? But curiosity won out. Mrs. Wilson. Her voice was softer than I'd imagined, nervous. I'm Tiffany Martinez. I think we need to talk. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. I can't imagine what we'd have to discuss. She looked nervous, playing with her purse strap. I know you probably hate me and you have every right to, but there are things about Mark, about the whole situation that you don't know. Things I think you deserve to hear. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her enter. She took in my simple apartment with guilty eyes, probably realizing that while she'd been playing house with my husband, I'd been kicked out of the home I'd lived in for over 15 years. I brought you something, she said, pulling a manila envelope from her purse. Photos, text messages, emails, evidence that might help your case. Took the envelope but didn't open it right away. Why would you help me? You're the one who destroyed my marriage. Tiffany's face crumpled. No, I'm not. That's what I came to tell you. I didn't destroy your marriage, Mrs. Wilson. Mark did. And he destroyed my life too. She sat down heavily on my couch, looking suddenly much older than her years. I need to start from the beginning, she said. Because what you think happened between Mark and me, it's not the whole truth. I remained, standing arms crossed, waiting. 7 months ago, I was having problems with my boyfriend. We were seeing a counselor trying to work through some issues. Mark was working on my parents' taxes and he seemed so understanding, so kind. He told me his marriage was over, that you two were just staying together because divorce was expensive, that you'd grown apart, that you barely spoke anymore, that you'd both agreed the marriage was dead. But neither of you wanted to go through the hassle of divorce. I felt a familiar flash of anger. Even in his affair, Mark had been rewriting our history to make himself the victim. He showed me text messages, Tiffany continued. Conversations that he claimed were between the two of you where you both agreed to see other people quietly until you could figure out the money stuff. He forged text messages. I think so. I mean, I never questioned them at the time because they seemed to fit with everything else he was telling me. He was so detailed about your supposed arrangement, so matter-of-fact about it. Tiffany opened her purse and pulled out her phone. But then last week, after my parents found out and confronted me, I started really thinking about those messages, and I realized I'd never actually seen them on your phone. Mark always showed them to me on his phone, claiming he'd screenshot them. She handed me her phone, showing me a series of text messages supposedly from me to Mark. These aren't from me, I said immediately. Look at the phone number. That's not even my number. I know. I figured that out when I tried to look up the number online. It doesn't exist. Mark created fake conversations to convince me you were okay with the affair. The planning behind that lie was breathtaking. Mark hadn't just cheated. He'd built an elaborate story to trick Tiffany into participating in his betrayal. There's more, Tiffany said quietly. Remember that night you went to visit your friend about 4 months ago? The weekend trip. He nodded. I'd gone to see my friend Lisa in Chicago, needing some space to process everything I'd learned about Mark and his family. Mark told me you were actually at a hotel with someone named Jake. He said you'd finally started seeing someone too, and that you were probably going to ask for a divorce soon. My blood ran cold. Jake is my friend's husband. I was visiting my friend and her family. I know that now, but Mark showed me hotel receipts with your name on them, credit card statements showing charges at romantic restaurants. He made it seem like you were having this passionate affair while he was stuck at home alone. Those were forged too. They had to be, because now I know you weren't having an affair at all. You were just trying to survive what he and his family were doing to you. Tiffany's voice broke slightly on the last words. Mrs. Wilson, I need you to understand something. I'm not a homewrecker. I would never have gotten involved with a married man if I'd thought he was lying about his situation. When Mark told me his marriage was over in everything but name, when he convinced me you were seeing someone else too, I thought we were all adults handling a difficult situation maturely. I sat down across from her, beginning to understand the scope of Mark's lies. How did you find out the truth? After my parents confronted me, I started questioning everything. I hired my own detective not to investigate you, but to investigate Mark to find out how much of what he told me was real. She pulled out the manila envelope I'd set aside. It's all in there. Evidence that Mark has been running similar tricks on other women for years. Before me there was someone named Ashley. Before Ashley there was Jennifer. Always young women having problems in their relationships. Always women he could convince that everyone involved was okay with the arrangement. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, printed emails, and what looked like a detailed investigative report. Mark is a serial cheater, Mrs. Wilson. And more than that, he's a serial manipulator. He specifically targets women who are vulnerable, tells them elaborate lies about his marriage, and convinces them they're not doing anything wrong. The first photo in the stack showed Mark with a woman I didn't recognize. Clearly taken at some kind of social event. They looked comfortable together. Lowe's. That's Ashley Miller, Tiffany explained. She's married to a businessman who travels frequently. Mark convinced her that you knew about their relationship and approved of it. When her husband found out and threatened to expose everything, Mark simply disappeared from her life and moved on to the next target. How many women? My investigator found evidence of at least 6 serious affairs over the past 10 years. Probably more casual ones that didn't leave as much of a paper trail. Years. Thought I'd been in a troubled marriage for the past few years, dealing with increasing hostility from Mark and his family. But the truth was, I'd been married to a stranger, a predator who used women's problems against them while systematically destroying his wife's self-worth at home. Why are you telling me this? Yes. Why help me? Tiffany was quiet for a long moment. Because Mark destroyed my life too. My parents are cutting me off completely, and they're making sure everyone in our social circle knows what I did. My reputation is ruined. My friends are ashamed of me, and I'm going to lose everything I have. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But the worst part isn't the social consequences or the financial cost. The worst part is knowing that I helped him hurt you, that I was part of the system he used to justify treating you like garbage. I looked through more of the photographs. Mark with different women, always looking relaxed and happy in a way I rarely saw at home. There's something else, Tiffany said. Something about his mother and sister that you need to know. What about them? They knew about all of it. My investigator found text messages between Mark and Helen where she's actually coaching him on how to manage multiple relationships. She was helping him keep track of his lies. The room seemed to spin around me. Helen knew about your affair. She knew about all the affairs. She encouraged them. There are messages where she's telling Mark that having other women will help him keep you in line because you'll be too insecure and jealous to make demands on him. I thought about all the times Helen had made subtle comments about my appearance, my desirability, my worthiness as a wife. Comments designed to make me feel like I should be grateful that Mark stayed with me at all. Karen was involved too, Tiffany continued. She helped Mark create fake social media profiles to communicate with his targets. She was the one who came up with the story about you having an affair with Jake. The systematic nature of their conspiracy was overwhelming. It wasn't just that they'd been cruel to me. They'd been actively working to destroy my sanity and self-worth while enabling Mark's betrayals. Mrs. Wilson, I know this doesn't fix anything. I know I can't undo the damage that's been done to your life or mine, but I wanted you to know that what happened to you wasn't random cruelty or a marriage that just went wrong. It was deliberate, calculated, psychological warfare. I set down the photographs, my hands trembling. They planned all of it, I said quietly. The isolation, the gaslighting, the affairs. They turned my marriage into a weapon against me. Yes, and they've been doing it for years. Probably to every woman Mark has ever been with seriously. My investigator thinks Helen might have had similar arrangements with Mark's father before he died. There are hints in some old family letters that suggest a pattern going back decades. Thought that this might be generational, that Helen had perhaps orchestrated similar psychological torture against other women in her family, made me physically sick. What are you going to do now? Asked. I'm going to testify in your divorce proceedings if your lawyer wants me to. I'm going to provide whatever evidence I have to help you get justice. And then I'm going to try to rebuild my life and figure out how to earn my parents' forgiveness. Stood up, smoothing down her skirt with nervous hands. I know you have no reason to forgive me, Mrs. Wilson. I know I was part of something that nearly destroyed you, even if I didn't understand what I was participating in at the time. But I want you to know that Mark never deserved you. And what his family did to you, it's criminal. Not just legally, but morally. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by evidence of my husband's systematic betrayal. Not just the affair I'd discovered, but years of affairs, years of manipulation, years of using other women's pain to justify his cruelty toward me. The man I'd been married to for 15 years didn't exist. He'd never existed. The person I'd loved, made excuses for, and tried so desperately to please had been an elaborate fiction designed to hide a predator. But as devastating as that realization was, it was also liberating because it meant that nothing that had happened to me was my fault. I hadn't failed as a wife. I'd been the victim of a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological abuse. And now I had the evidence to prove it. When I called Tommy that evening, my voice was steady and sure. I have new evidence, I told him. Evidence that's going to change everything. What kind of evidence? The kind that's going to ensure Mark never gets the chance to do this to anyone else. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a force for justice. Not just for me but for all the women Mark had manipulated and destroyed over the years. The war was about to become a crusade. The conference room at Tommy's law firm had never felt so charged with electricity. 4 weeks after Tiffany's visit, we'd assembled what looked like a war council. Tommy, 2 associate attorneys, Tiffany and her lawyer, Ashley Miller, Mark's previous victim who'd flown in from Denver, and Jennifer Walsh, the woman before Ashley, who'd driven down from Philadelphia. I looked around the table at these women I'd never met before, but who shared an experience I understood all too well. Each of them had been carefully selected, manipulated, and discarded by my husband. Each had been convinced they were participating in an ethical arrangement between consenting adults. Each had discovered too late that they'd been pawns in Mark's twisted game. Ladies, Tommy began, spreading out a timeline chart that covered the entire conference table. What we have here isn't just evidence of adultery. This is evidence of a systematic pattern of fraud, manipulation, and psychological abuse spanning over a decade. Ashley leaned forward, studying the timeline. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed with the kind of controlled composure that came from years of executive boardrooms. I had no idea there were others, she said quietly. Mark made me feel like I was the only person who'd ever understood him outside his marriage. That's exactly what he told me, Jennifer added. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with an artist's hands that trembled slightly as she pointed to her section of the timeline. He said his marriage was basically over, that you two were just going through the motions until you could afford to divorce properly. Tiffany nodded grimly. Same story he told me, word for word in some cases. I studied the timeline, seeing my marriage laid out in black and white alongside Mark's betrayals. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Affair had followed the same script, the same manipulation tactics, the same careful construction of lies. Here's what makes this particularly evil, Tommy continued, pointing to specific dates. Mark wasn't just cheating. He was using each affair to justify escalating abuse at home. Look at the timeline of Emma's recordings. He pulled out transcripts of some of the conversations I'd recorded. Every time Mark started a new relationship, the psychological abuse at home got worse. It's as if having an affair gave him permission to treat his wife even worse. Because it did, I said, understanding flooding through me. He felt justified in his cruelty because he'd convinced himself I deserved it. After all, if these other women found him charming and desirable, the problem had to be with me. Tommy's associate, Lisa Chen, pulled out another set of documents. But here's where it gets even worse. We found evidence that Helen and Karen weren't just enabling Mark's affairs. They were actively recruiting his victims. The room went silent. "What do you mean recruiting?" Ashley asked. Lisa opened a laptop and projected an image onto the wall. It was a screenshot of a social media group called Women Supporting Women. Helen created this private Facebook group 4 years ago, Lisa explained. On the surface, it appears to be a support group for women having relationship difficulties. But look at the member list. She clicked through several profiles. Jennifer, you were a member of this group in 2018. Ashley, you joined in 2019. Tiffany, you were added in 2021. Felt sick. They were hunting for vulnerable women online. It gets worse, Tommy said. We've analyzed the group's activity logs. Helen and Karen would identify women who posted about relationship problems, particularly women whose boyfriends or husbands traveled frequently or who seemed isolated from their families. He clicked to another screen showing private message threads. They would befriend these women, offer support and advice, and gradually introduce the idea that sometimes relationships need flexibility to survive. They'd share stories about couples who'd found happiness through discreet arrangements. Jennifer's face had gone pale. I remember Helen messaging me privately after I posted about feeling lonely while my boyfriend was traveling for work. She was so understanding, so supportive. She told me about a friend of hers who'd found companionship with a married man whose wife was okay with the arrangement. She told me the same thing. Ashley whispered. Made it sound so mature, so civilized. Tiffany was staring at the screen in horror. They were grooming us like predators groom children. That's exactly what they were doing, Tommy confirmed. And once they had identified a potential target, they'd arrange for Mark to accidentally meet her at social events, at the gym, always in situations that seemed completely natural. I thought about all the times Helen had insisted on accompanying me to community events. All the women she'd chatted with. While I stood silently by her side. Women I'd thought she was just being friendly to. How many women? I asked, afraid of the answer. Lisa consulted her notes. We've identified 15 women who were members of the support group and had subsequent contact with Mark. Of those, 6 definitely had affairs with him. We're still investigating the others. 15 women. 15 lives potentially destroyed by my husband and his family's systematic manipulation. There's something else, Tommy said, grimly. We found evidence that Helen has been running similar schemes for years, possibly decades. Before the Facebook group, she used church groups, community organizations, even book clubs to identify and target vulnerable women. He pulled out a box of old letters and documents. These belonged to Mark's father. After he died, Helen kept all his papers. Hidden among his business documents, we found correspondence that suggests he was also involved in extramarital affairs, all following the same pattern. Picked up one of the letters, dated 25 years ago. It was from a woman named Carol thanking Helen for her understanding and support during a difficult time in her marriage, and expressing gratitude for Helen's introduction to a wonderful man who helped her remember what it felt like to be appreciated. My God, I breathed. This is generational. Helen learned this from watching her own husband, and then she taught it to Mark. It's a family business, Tiffany said bitterly. Destroying marriages and manipulating women is literally the family business. Ashley stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Do you know what the worst part is? I actually liked her. Helen, I mean. After Mark introduced us, she would call me sometimes just to chat. She'd tell me how happy she was that Mark had found someone who understood him. How grateful she was that I was bringing joy back into his life. She told me the same thing, Jennifer said. Made me feel like I was doing something noble, helping a good man survive a difficult marriage. I remembered Helen's knowing smiles, the way she'd sometimes pat my hand sympathetically after Mark had been particularly cruel. She was getting satisfaction from both sides, I realized. She enjoyed watching Mark hurt me, and she enjoyed befriending the women he was using to justify that hurt. Helen Wilson is a psychological predator, Tommy said grimly. She feeds on the destruction of other women's lives and relationships. And she's been doing it. For decades. What can we do about it? Tiffany asked. I mean, legally, can we stop her from doing this to other women? We're building a case for criminal conspiracy and fraud, Lisa explained. The fake social media profiles, the forged documents, the systematic targeting of vulnerable women. It all adds up to a pattern of criminal behavior. But more than that, Tommy added. We're going to make sure everyone knows what they've been doing. Every woman in that support group, every community organization Helen has been involved with, every church and social club. They're all going to learn exactly what kind of predators they've been harboring. I looked around the table at these women who'd been victimized by my husband and his family. Despite everything they'd been through, they were here, willing to fight back, willing to expose the truth, even though it meant reliving their own pain and embarrassment. There's something I need to tell all of you, I said. Something I've been thinking about since we started uncovering all of this. The room grew quiet. I spent 15 years making excuses for Mark's behavior. I told myself he was just going through a difficult phase, that his mother's influence was temporary, that if I just loved him enough, everything would get better. Paused, gathering my courage. But the truth is, I knew something was wrong before I caught him cheating. I knew the way he and his family treated me wasn't normal. I just chose to ignore it. Because it was easier than facing the reality that my marriage was built on manipulation and abuse. Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That doesn't make any of this your fault. I know that now. But I need you all to understand something. Mark didn't become a predator because of his mother's influence or because of some childhood trauma or because he fell into bad patterns over time. He's a predator because he chooses to be one. Every lie he told, every woman he manipulated, every cruel thing he said to me, those were conscious choices. What are you saying? Ashley asked. I'm saying we need to stop giving him excuses. We need to stop treating this like it's some kind of tragic misunderstanding or mental illness. Mark Wilson is a calculating predator who systematically destroys women's lives for his own entertainment, and he needs to face consequences that match the severity of his crimes. Tommy smiled proudly. That's exactly the approach we're taking. Mark, Helen, and Karen are going to face both criminal and civil consequences. But more than that, we're going to make sure their methods are exposed so completely that no other woman will ever fall for their manipulations again. Tiffany looked around the table with determination in her eyes. What do you need from us? Everything, Tommy said. Every text message, every email, every conversation you remember, every lie they told you, every manipulation they used. We're going to document it all and present it to the world. As the meeting broke up, I found myself standing with the 3 women who'd been my husband's other victims. We were strangers brought together by betrayal and manipulation. But looking at them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt sisterhood, real, honest connection with people who understood exactly what I'd survived. Thank you, I said to each of them, for coming forward, for being willing to fight back, for helping me realize I wasn't crazy or oversensitive, or any of the other things they tried to convince me I was. Thank you for having the courage to start this, Ashley replied. For refusing to let them get away with it. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the network of lies and manipulation that had controlled my life for so many years. Mark, Helen, and Karen had built their whole world on the systematic destruction of other people's happiness. They'd turned cruelty into an art form and manipulation into a family tradition. But now their victims were fighting back. And we weren't fighting alone. We were fighting together, armed with the truth, and determined to make sure no other woman would suffer what we'd suffered. The predators had finally met their match, and we were just getting started. 7 months after that night when Mark spit in my face, I stood in the courthouse watching him being led away in handcuffs. The judge had just sentenced him to 2 years in prison for conspiracy to commit identity theft, fraud, and systematic harassment. Helen had received 3 years. Karen got 18 months. But more satisfying than the prison sentences was watching their entire world crumble. In the months leading up to this day, The local newspaper had run a series of articles about the marriage manipulation network, as they dubbed it. Every detail of their systematic predation had been exposed. The fake support group, the decades of targeting vulnerable women, the psychological warfare they'd conducted against their victims. All of it was now public knowledge. Mark had lost his job within days of the story breaking. Dr. Richardson had made sure of that, using his considerable influence to ensure that no accounting firm in the state would hire him. Helen's church had quietly asked her to stop attending services. Karen's employer, a family therapy center, had terminated her immediately for conduct incompatible with our mission of supporting healthy relationships. But the social consequences, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to the civil judgments. Tiffany, Ashley, Jennifer, and I had filed a joint lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy, and fraud. The settlement had been substantial enough to ensure that none of us would ever have to worry about financial security again. More importantly, it had funded something I'd never imagined I'd be part of creating. Emma! Tommy appeared beside me as the courthouse emptied. The reporter from Channel 9 wants to do a follow-up interview. Are you up for it? He nodded. Over the past few months, I'd become something I'd never expected to be. An advocate. A voice for women who'd been systematically manipulated and abused by people who were supposed to love them. The interview took place on the courthouse steps, with a reporter asking questions I'd answered dozens of times by now. But I never got tired of telling the story because each time I told it, another woman somewhere recognized her own experience and realized she wasn't alone. Mrs. Wilson, the reporter asked, what would you say to women who might be experiencing similar manipulation in their own relationships? I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the women who might be watching, women who were living the life I'd escaped from. I tell them that love shouldn't make you smaller, I said. Real love doesn't require you to apologize for existing or to accept cruelty disguised as honesty or to make yourself invisible to keep the peace. The people in your life are systematically destroying your self-worth. That's not love, that's abuse. After the interview, I drove to my new house. Not an apartment anymore, but a real house with a garden and windows that let in actual sunlight. It was smaller than the house I'd shared with Mark, but it was entirely mine. Chosen by me, decorated according to my tastes for the first time in 15 years. Tiffany was waiting on my front porch with a bottle of champagne and a folder full of papers. It's official, she said, holding up the documents. The Wilson Awareness Foundation is now a registered non-profit organization. We decided to formalize our advocacy work, creating a foundation that would help other women recognize and escape from systematic manipulation. Tiffany had used her settlement money to fund it, and Ashley and Jennifer had both committed to serving on the board of directors. How many women have contacted us this week? I asked as we settled in my living room. 52, Tiffany said, consulting her notes. 4 of them are situations we think might require immediate intervention. And we got a call from a prosecutor in Texas who thinks she's identified a similar network operating in Houston. It turned out that the Wilson family's methods weren't unique. Across the country, there were other predators using similar tactics to systematically destroy women's lives. Our foundation was helping to identify and expose them, one case at a time. My phone rang and I saw Ashley's name on the screen. Emma, turn on Channel 7 right now, she said without preamble. You need to see this. I grabbed the remote and switched channels. The evening news was showing footage of a woman being arrested outside what looked like a community center. The reporter was explaining that she'd been running a support group that was actually a front for targeting vulnerable women for manipulation and exploitation. That's exactly what Helen was doing, Tiffany breathed. Same tactics, same predatory behavior. And she probably learned it from Helen, I replied. Or someone like her. These techniques get passed around, shared among predators like some kind of twisted knowledge base. The news story continued, explaining that the arrest had come about after several women had recognized the patterns described in recent media coverage of the Wilson case and contacted authorities. We're making a difference, I said. And for the first time in months, I felt genuine pride in what we'd accomplished. Later that evening, after Tiffany had gone home, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. It had been exactly 1 year since I'd first discovered Mark's affair. 1 year since I'd begun the process of reclaiming my life. The woman I'd been then, frightened, broken, convinced that her worth depended on other people's approval, felt like a stranger to me now. I'd thought that woman was weak, that she'd somehow deserved the treatment she'd received. But I understood now that she'd been strong in ways I'd never appreciated. She'd survived years of systematic psychological torture and still retained enough sense of self to recognize when something was wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Saw the news about the Texas arrest. We're really doing this, aren't we? We're actually changing things. I typed back. We're just getting started. And it was true. The Wilson Awareness Foundation was already working with law enforcement agencies in 8 states, helping them identify and prosecute similar networks. We'd created educational materials for counselors, social workers, and clergy to help them recognize the signs of systematic manipulation. We'd established a confidential hotline for women who thought they might be victims. Most importantly, we'd refused to be ashamed of what had happened to us. Instead of hiding our experiences, we turned them into weapons against the people who tried to destroy us. A year ago, I'd been a woman whose husband spit in her face while his family applauded. Tonight, I was a woman who'd brought down a network of predators and was working to ensure that no other woman would suffer what I'd suffered. The transformation still amazed me sometimes. Thanks for watching Granny's Voice.